5 centuries before Columbus set foot on American shores, Norse settlers had already established outposts in the New World. Then they vanished without a trace. What drove these fearless explorers to abandon their American dream? The sagas tell of brave voyages west across the treacherous Atlantic. Leif Erikson's discovery of Vinland around 1000 CE marked the beginning of European presence in North America. Archaeological evidence at Meadows in Newfoundland confirms these Norse settlements existed. Yet within a few decades, these pioneering colonies were abandoned, their stories reduced to whispered legends. What catastrophe befell these hardy Norse explorers who had conquered the Atlantic only to retreat from its western shores? The answer lies in a perfect storm of challenges that transformed promising settlements into untenable outposts. At the heart of the Vikings' withdrawal was a brutally simple numbers problem. The small Norse expeditions, rarely more than a few hundred people, faced indigenous populations that outnumbered them dramatically. The sagas describe encounters with people they called Skraelings, likely Algonquian-speaking peoples, or Thule Inuit. Initial trading relationships deteriorated into violent conflicts. Unlike in other Norse expansions, reinforcements were too far away to tip the balance. Imagine standing on Vinland's shores, or watching hostile warriors gather on distant hills, knowing the nearest allies were an ocean away. Climate played its own treacherous role. The medieval warm period that had made the North Atlantic crossings feasible was beginning to wane. Sea ice extended its reach, making the already perilous voyages between Greenland and Vinland increasingly dangerous. Each crossing represented an enormous gamble of lives and resources. Perhaps most critically, the economic calculus simply didn't add up. The Vikings were practical explorers, and their colonial efforts were driven by resource acquisition. Yet Vinland offered little that couldn't be obtained closer to home or through established trade networks. Timber, the most valuable American resource, could be harvested from closer European forests or imported from established trading partners at lower risk. While the sagas immortalize Vinland's wild grapes and self-sowing wheat, these treasures proved insufficient to justify the blood price of staying. Meanwhile, more lucrative opportunities beckoned elsewhere. As Vikings expanded east into Russia and south into the Mediterranean, the risky Western colonies became less attractive. The establishment of Norse Christian kingdoms redirected the warrior energy that had fueled earlier expansion. They came, they saw, they calculated, they left. This strategic retreat wasn't a dramatic evacuation, but a slow abandonment. As settlers returned to Greenland or Iceland and weren't replaced, the tenuous foothold in North America simply faded away. By 1020 CE, the American Viking Age had ended almost as quickly as it began. The Viking retreat from America represents one of history's great might-have-beens. Had they persisted, established stronger footholds, or returned in greater numbers, the subsequent history of the continent might have unfolded entirely differently. The archaeological evidence at Meadows tells a haunting story. Carefully dismantled buildings, few personal items left behind, a planned departure rather than a chaotic flight. The Vikings didn't flee in panic. They made a calculated decision to leave behind a land that promised more hardship than reward. 5 centuries would pass before Europeans would again establish permanent settlements on American shores, leaving us to wonder, what if the Vikings had stayed? 5 centuries before Columbus, the Vikings had already proven America could be reached. They simply decided it wasn't worth keeping.